In Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist doubts that Jesus is the Messiah, even after baptizing him. At least that's what it seems like. See, John sends his disciples to Jesus either as a strategic move or because John legitimately doubts the identity of Christ. And I think the way that we make sense of what's really happening is by looking at the surrounding context. That's why in this video, we're going to make sense of what's really going on here. And we'll discover the deeper message by walking through this passage in context. Along the way, we'll make 7 key observations that are necessary to understand the depth of this moment. Let's jump into Matthew chapter 11. Welcome to Above Reproach Ministries. I'm Jason Camacho. We're starting chapter 11. Today, we are making it through the Gospel of Matthew. Hey, please do like this video and subscribe if this content blesses you. And if you're new here, welcome. And then let me know in the comments any questions you have, any additional insights, or just comment on what you took away from this study. And I recommend you watch our previous teachings on Matthew by clicking the link in the description below. Starting in verse 1, it says, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and to preach in their cities. And I just want us to be thinking about how John the Baptist is about to come up in this whole situation. His 12 disciples, right? He instructed them, he went on, and then he sent them out to preach, right, in those cities. And then Jesus ends up going into those cities to teach where the disciples had prepared the people. So here's the first observation for us. It's almost like there are many John the Baptists being sent out. And here's what I mean. Jesus sends them ahead of him to go prepare the cities for his arrival. And in this sense, they're kind of functioning as 12 mini John the Baptist, which is interesting because John the Baptist comes up in the next verse as the one who prepared the way for the Messiah. And John the Baptist, even from prison, is going to take the spotlight in this chapter. So considering what Jesus said about his apostles functioning as prophets of old in the last section, it's interesting that John the Baptist is coming up again, because he is the greatest prophet, as Jesus will mention in verse 10 and 11. So on the heels of John's preparatory ministry, right, he prepared the way, sent by God to prepare the way for the Christ. The apostles now get to function as prophets who are sent by Jesus to continue that preparation differently, with more, I guess, precision and being able to minister to individual towns and cities and villages. So verse 2, when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ. Now, I think this is going to be an emphasis in this text as well, is the actual works of Jesus that validate his identity claims and prove who he is. He sent word by his disciples. And here's what he says through his disciples. Are you the one who is to come? And you're like, well, I don't think John's really doubting there. Or shall we look for another? And you're like, well, if he's wondering if they should continue the journey looking for someone else, then maybe he is. So let's just read this in context, try and make sense of what's happening. We saw Jesus send out his disciples to preach the good news, bring the terms of peace in his name. Now John is sending his disciples to question what is unclear about Jesus' ministry. Jesus has clarified some key points about his ministry in this chapter or the previous chapter. Now John's in prison, currently waiting, wondering maybe. And I wonder if this imprisonment may have something to do with his inquiry, him sending his disciples. In John's mind, it is possible, I'm not saying this is certain, but it is possible that his current situation doesn't quite match up with his expectations about what Jesus establishing the kingdom on earth would look like. So here's the second observation. The prophets are being persecuted, right? Considering what Jesus said about his apostles being persecuted through the entire last chapter, it's interesting that now we see John suffering as the one who prepared the way for the Messiah in prison. He's suffering wrongfully because of his faithfulness to God. So here's a very practical example of what Jesus warned his apostles was coming their way. So again, is John genuinely wondering here? Or is this a test for his disciples? And he's just the master sensei, sending his disciples out to see and have their faith encouraged. I think Matthew chapter 3, verse 11, we see Jesus, or rather John the Baptist, he says, I baptize with water for repentance, right? But he who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. He'll baptize you with the Spirit and with fire. So he who is coming is who John is talking about in chapter 11. He who is to come. Are you the one who is to come? And whatever John thinks about that person, that Messiah, that Old Testament prophetic image, it involves this person baptizing with the Holy Spirit and fire, gathering with his winnowing fork, separating the chaff from the wheat. So that's at least what John the Baptist is possibly asking about. And so I just wonder what it would mean to look for another, right? Because the one who is to accomplish the messianic prophecies of old, when John is referenced as the forerunner of God in Malachi 3, which, by the way, Jesus is about to quote from Malachi 3 to state something clear about John the Baptist and his ministry, right? We see that idea of the one who is coming. In Malachi 3, when we see the forerunner, and Jesus references that here, in that chapter of Malachi, it's God who is coming. So I just wonder what it looks like for John to look for another. What would that search involve? Like if John is really doubting, which I don't really think he is, that Jesus is the one they've been looking for, how are we to make sense of his doubt? Right, verse 4, and Jesus answered them. It's interesting that he doesn't answer John's inquiry. It says he's answering the messengers. Of course, they're representing John, so they are his immediate people to speak to. Go and tell John what you hear, what you see. Right? Because what has John heard? He's heard about what Jesus is doing. He has not seen it, but he's heard. Right? So now the messengers are going to carry eyewitness testimony of what they have seen, not just what the rumors are, not just what is being said, but what they've actually witnessed. So likely they're going to see these things happening. So again, as the apostles are declaring the message of Christ with these affirming signs and wonders in the previous chapter, they're testifying of what they've seen Jesus do. Now, Jesus is sending John's disciples back as a witness to John the Baptist himself. So they're bringing eyewitness testimony of Jesus' kingdom coming to the earth. We've seen it. We've heard the teachings. We've seen the power. Here's the third observation is the seeing and hearing, right? Jesus will continue saying the blind receive their what? Their sight, parallel to seeing. And the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf are hearing, which is what they're hearing. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And so Jesus will reference in chapter 13, the apostles are uniquely able. I think it's in chapter 13, verse 10, if I'm not mistaken. They're just going, hey, why are you talking in parables? Jesus goes, well, to you it's been given to know the secrets. And they're like, okay. And he quotes from Isaiah. And then he says, blessed are your eyes, they see, and your ears, for they hear. The people of old, the prophets and righteous, they longed to see and hear what you're experiencing, right? The Messiah is here, God in the flesh, come down to his people from heaven with this clear divine power emanating from him, and his teachings carry such authority, like they're experiencing what the people of old long to. It's a unique opportunity. So Jesus tells them what to report, what they hear and what they see. They're going to see blind people having their eyes open. They're going to see deaf people having their ears open. This reference to the eyes and ears makes the healed people almost the ones who bear witness to the power of Jesus. So Jesus quotes from Isaiah chapter 35 right here. He says, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. This is a messianic prophecy to clarify what he's doing, right? As an Old Testament, what's it called? If you were educated in the Old Testament and you were an ancient Israelite in the first century, you would know what he's referencing and what that chapter entailed about the Messiah. So he's validating his mission and identity by his works. John's gospel, there are many moments where Jesus does this. So he's doing everything God said his Messiah would do, his chosen anointed one. So his works clearly validate his messianic identity as based on the Old Testament promises. So if John's wondering, are you the one? Jesus is going, this is what the Old Testament said the Messiah would do. Here's what I'm doing. Now go tell him what you've seen me actually do. And blessed is the one who's not offended by me. It's been a long time coming, but the new edition of my book Fruitful is officially available in both paperback and digital version. It's perfect for small group discussion, church-wide discipleship, or even just your own personal faith. It lays out the clear gospel, your identity, your purpose, and God's process for your life. So grab your copy on the homepage of my website or sample the first chapter on Amazon. Or if you like reading on your devices, snag your digital copy on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Apple iBooks. I believe it will absolutely bless you and strengthen your relationship with God. All right, let's get back to the video. And it might sound like Jesus, I don't know, is like accusing John of being offended by him. I don't think that's what's happening. We saw in the last chapter people who would be offended of Christ, his message, his kingdom, his apostles, people who were not of peace, not worthy, not receptive or open, but hostile and violent. We've already seen that category of people, and John the Baptist doesn't seem to fit that. Not that that's the only category of being offended by Jesus, but that's the nearest, most immediate example. So is Jesus accusing John of being offended or bothered by the timing and the methodology of Jesus' ministry? Is possibly allowing John to be in prison when Jesus came to set the captives free. Is that possibly proving to be a stumbling block for John? I think when we think of offense, we should more have in view the idea of a stumbling block, and I'll get to that in a minute. But being offended by Jesus seems to involve, again, his ministry, mission, and kingdom. And here's the fourth observation, is being offended. The idea of being offended by Jesus was already explained in chapter 10, verse 34 through 39. So go watch that video teaching if you've not already. It's preferring unbelieving family over Jesus. It's rejecting Jesus in unbelief. His message, his kingdom, it's choosing not to die with him on the cross to yourself in faith. It's choosing not to give up your life in faith to find the life of God in Jesus. It's choosing not to side with Jesus, but siding with unbelievers in violence towards God and his kingdom. So this statement about not being offended has already been clarified, and it's going to continue to be clarified throughout the rest of this section. So just hang on. If you're like, I don't know what it means to be offended by Jesus. Am I? Are they? How do I know? Jesus will spell it out even more clearly with some examples. So the New Testament does quote from Isaiah to speak of the stone and the stumbling God puts before the people. We see that in Peter's writing. We see that in Paul's writing, I believe. Jesus himself quotes it in, I think, Matthew 25 with the parable of the wicked vineyard tenants. The cornerstone God has chosen has been rejected by those who are building their own thing. The cornerstone's been rejected because he didn't fit their agenda and their plan and their, whatever it is that they were building. So Jesus is a stumbling block that God puts before people. They reject Jesus because he doesn't fit into what they're building. He doesn't fit into their system, even though he's the cornerstone of what God is building, chosen and precious, and that will get quoted in the rest of Matthew. So that's how we should at least begin to understand what it means that someone is offended by Jesus. He gets in the way of their own pursuit of righteousness by their efforts and works and self-merit. Like, he doesn't fit their system and their idea of what God is supposed to be, and da-da-da-da-da. So as they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. And it's interesting that he doesn't talk about John while his messengers are around. Almost like, not to speculate too much, but is it possible that Jesus does not want John to know what he's about to say? What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? And I think also by turning to the crowds and clarifying the ministry of John, Jesus is making it clear that the idea of being offended by him, he's not talking about John, he's talking about the people that are immediately in front of him who might not believe or receive what he's doing in the earth. He said, what did you go out to see? Remember? Blessed are those who see and hear, and you guys get to hear and see these things. Well, when it comes to John, the rumors you heard, the things he was doing, baptizing in the Jordan, looking all weird and kind of like Elijah, like, what did you expect? A reed shaken by the wind? So it's interesting that Jesus pauses to address the people's reason for going out to John. And they're like, why did we? As well as their expectations. What did you expect to see? And this relates to what people expect about the Messiah. So you almost map on the expectations about the forerunner, kind of map on to the expectations about the Messiah. And people are going to be offended by Jesus because he does not match up with their assumptions, their biases, their traditions, their expectations, their misunderstandings of the Old Testament. So when he doesn't fit, he's a problem, get him out of there. And that's what they did with John. So the two correspond to each other, right? Here's the fifth observation. I've already touched on this, but Jesus is the stumbling block. He's a stumbling block to those who don't know God and pursue righteousness by works. This idea is all throughout the New Testament. He gets in the way of their man-centered plans and agenda, right? His character, his mission, his message does not fit their mold of what he's supposed to be as the Messiah. And the same goes for John. Now you wonder, what does it mean to go and see a reed shaken by the wind? Well, as best as I've been able to conclude from my research, essentially Jesus is making the point. John was not a coward that was swayed by the opinions of man, right? He wasn't blown around with the wind. His message and his mission stayed the same. No matter what people thought, no matter what people expected, and how they tried to project those onto him, right? He is who he is. Later in chapter 12, the reed is going to be referenced again, this idea of a reed, in the context of what Jesus really came to do. And that mentioning of a reed is a quotation from Isaiah. So it's interesting, Jesus will use this image of a reed to clarify the mission of John and the mission and ministry of himself. And then he goes, okay, what did you go out to see? And they're like, well, I guess we didn't go out to see a coward. Like, we didn't expect that based on what we heard. He was calling the religious leaders brood of vipers. A man dressed in soft clothing? Is that what you guys expected to go out and see? No, we know what he looked like. We know what his breath smelled like. Having a diet of locusts and honey. Like, at least that's what we heard. So those who wear soft clothing are in king's houses, right? They might have expected royalty or the messenger of the Lord in Malachi to be beautiful and soft in appearance, and luxury was his defining characteristic. That's the opposite of who John really was. Whether or not they expected that is another conversation. So either Jesus is stating what they expected, or he's making a point about how you didn't expect to see that, right? Either of those things, a coward or a luxurious royal man who's soft, and no, you didn't expect to see that. You heard about him. You heard about John. You heard the rumors. You knew what to expect when you actually went out in the wilderness. So I think they knew. Now Jesus shifts to himself in a minute to make a point about their expectations and misconceptions about the Messiah. So we see that play out in the next few verses. How Jesus didn't fit their mold and they're frustrated and offended. He contradicts their misunderstood view of who he's supposed to be. And lest we think this is an isolated case, this is not the only time where Jesus will kind of clarify his ministry and mission by using the ministry of John. We'll see this later. They'll come up and say, by what authority do you do these things? He'll go, let me ask you this. By what authority was John doing what he did? Whose authority was he sent in? And they'll go, oof, we can't say this or this, so we don't know. So Jesus clarifies, you don't understand that, you won't understand me and what I'm doing. Here's the sixth observation, the greatest prophet. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, more than a prophet. You weren't looking for a soft, coward dressed in, luxury, and you went out to see a prophet. And I'll tell you, Elijah is one of the greatest examples in the Old Testament of a prophet. He is essentially the face of the prophets. And we know what Elijah was like. He wore, a garment of camel's hair, just like John. He was kind of wild and rugged looking and lived out there and only God knows where, and now John is playing that role in this season of history. And he says, yes, more than a prophet. And you're like, whoa, you can be more than a prophet? So before we get into that, here's the sixth observation. John is the last prophet before Jesus. And you go, no, he's not. We have prophets in the New Testament. Jesus sends his apostles as prophets. He tells them that. Apostles and prophets lay the foundation in Ephesians 2. Well, John signals the end of an era, and he signals the beginning of the new one in the Messiah. So that era of prophets, the Old Testament prophets, it culminates in John. He's the last and the greatest. Every other prophet Jesus said was coming. John is the only one who was able, or let me say it like this, every other prophet said Jesus is, or the Messiah is coming. They were expecting, they were looking ahead. John is the only prophet pre-Jesus that is able to say, there he is. He's right there. I see him. This is all about seeing and experiencing in this unique season of human history, God in the flesh. So Jesus is correcting or expanding their view of who John really was, lest they be confused. He prepared the way for the Messiah. And I love that this clarification needs to be made because it has implications on what they think about Jesus. If you reject John's testimony about the Messiah, you'll end up rejecting Jesus. Just as Jesus has said, if people reject the apostles and their message, they're really rejecting God and his Son. Right? So here's the seventh observation. The Lord is coming. And you're like, what? What are you talking about? Look at verse 10. This is he of whom it is written. See an Old Testament quotation, read that chapter at least. Get as much context as you can from that scroll. Because often when the New Testament authors quote from the Old Testament, a high percentage of the time they're quoting from the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. But the point is they're quoting from an entire section. They've already preloaded all the surrounding ideas into this quotation so that when you hear it, if you're a good student, if you're a good Israelite and you know your Torah and you know your prophets, you would understand all the ideas that come attached to that quotation. So when he quotes from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1 here, it's probably a lot you'll see in that chapter that parallels to this. He says, behold, I send my messenger before your face. What's interesting is if you actually read Malachi 3:1, here's how it reads, right? I'll send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way before you. Malachi 3:1 reads, behold, I send my messenger. This is the Lord speaking. He will prepare the way before me. And the Lord who you seek will suddenly come. And they'll say, behold, he's coming. So when John talks about, are you the one who is to come? Or in chapter 3, one who is coming after me is mightier than I suspect, I think we know this now in hindsight, but I suspect John knew this as well, that Jesus, the Messiah, was actually God incarnate. Because here it's the messengers being sent ahead of the Messiah. In Malachi 3, it's God himself. And you can say, well, the Messiah represents God. I don't play that game of just representing, especially with the New Testament language about Jesus being far more than just a human figure. But either way, Jesus is placed, I think, in no uncertain terms, in the slot of Yahweh, as John is preparing his way. The Lord is coming. And that's why John is readying the people. And people do not like what they see because they've come to believe falsehood. And they've come to believe wrong things about the Messiah and about God. And their presuppositions are clouding their vision and their judgment. So it's interesting that John sent messengers to kind of understand who Jesus is, clarify, like, are you really who we thought? As if the two are inextricably connected. John's ministry clarifies the ministry of Jesus. The forerunner clarifies the identity of the one whose way he's preparing, which makes Jesus out to be Yahweh. That's why in the next section, as we get to verse 11, Jesus clarifies that, hey, John did his thing, and the people didn't respond appropriately. We're going to see they were offended. They found something wrong. Jesus did his thing. They were offended by him too. They found something wrong with him. They wanted something other than who God actually was, which is why they're offended when he shows up right in front of them. But we'll have to save that for the next video. So, why does John the Baptist send disciples to Jesus? Either, number one, because John genuinely doubts, or he's really just swirling in his mind, imprisonment, you came to set the captives free, this ain't supposed to be what's happening, and he's not able to reconcile that. or because he's using this opportunity from prison to continue bringing more clarity to his disciples about the Messiah and his mission. Almost like at a distance, he's still playing his role. He finished it, he decreased, he lessened, so Jesus increases, and he's continuing to maybe play that role from prison. Either way, someone is confused, someone is misunderstood, and needs to drop their wrong expectations about the Messiah in order to receive Jesus, who he actually is, humbly, rather than being offended and going, you're not who you're supposed to be. Jesus is using this opportunity to clarify his identity and mission in his kingdom. So here's some passages I want you to cross-reference for even more clarity on what Jesus means. Isaiah 35, the whole passage Jesus quotes from. Malachi chapter 3, the whole chapter, go read that, the messenger, the forerunner. Luke 7, 18 through 28, the parallel account in Luke. And then 1 Peter 2, 6 through 8, the rock of stumbling. Jesus is to those who are offended by him. So there is more I'd like to share about this passage for us to reflect on and apply to our lives, but this is long enough already. So I'm going to post a follow-up video on the exclusive video section of our website for monthly supporters. In that video, I'll walk you through some key applications and we will reflect on this profound wisdom. So if you're a monthly supporter, go check that out on the website in the exclusive video section. If you'd rather just skip that video and download my notes directly from this video, those are also available to our monthly supporters, along with all the other sermon notes from every teaching I've done. Just my way of saying thank you. So in the next section, Jesus is going to say some startling things. He says, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John. And you're like, oh, geez. Then he'll say, he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And then he's like, hey, from now, or from John until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. And we're like, whoa, what is happening here? And so you're going to see that the people of Jesus' generation are like children, sitting in the marketplace, calling to their playmates, and we go, what is happening, man? What does Jesus mean by these things? You'll have to tune into the next teaching to find out. Like this video, subscribe, leave a comment letting me know what stood out to you, what questions you have, about John. Is he doubting, or is he trying to convince his disciples? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey, if you're not a monthly supporter yet of this ministry, here's why you'll want to become one today. You get access to exclusive teachings every week. Right now, I'm going through Genesis, looking at the Hebrew and drawing out deeper insights. You'll get access to all of my biblical parallel worksheets. And there are other benefits for higher tiers, like unlimited access to all of my sermon notes, free access to paid Bible courses, and even early access to weekly Bible teachings. So go check that out on the website, and thank you for supporting this ministry to help us teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. I'll see you in the next video.